This video is based on one of our readings for this week, The Problem with Intelligence by Stephen Cave. In his article, Cave makes the case that the very concept of intelligence is a highly value-laden one, and that there are good reasons to identify and be aware of the historical, political, and social dimensions of the concept of intelligence. To be a value-laden term is essentially to be injected with some kind of judgment or opinion. Some terms are obviously value-laden, like characterizing someone as a freedom fighter versus a rebel or an insurgent. Some terms are less obviously value-laden. They may convey certain judgments or opinions that are not immediately obvious, but which are evinced through the history or contextual use of a term. Cave argues that intelligence is just such a term. He points to the history of the concept of intelligence to uncover its relationship to power structures and the sustaining of hegemonic hierarchies. The relationship between intelligence and power can be traced as far back as Plato, and probably farther. Plato envisaged a utopian society wherein the ruler was certified by virtue of his intellectual capacity. In the language of the time, the man most appropriate to rule was the one who had the greatest virtue of reason. This man ought to be the ideal ruler in Plato's ideal society, the philosopher king. Aristotle, the student of Plato, took the association between rulership and reason even further, by imagining a society structured to a significant degree by the capacity of reason. A hierarchy of social striations, in part determined by the degree of reason possessed by each occupant of a given social stratus, was a feature of Aristotle's ideal society. Skip forward a couple thousand years, and Descartes argues that rationality is the purview only of human beings and God. What distinguishes humans is mind. What distinguishes animals, plants, everything else was not having one. Immanuel Kant in the 18th century held that the capacity of reason is a prerequisite for moral status, that is, to be seen as possessing moral agency. So, what's the point here? Reason and rationality, taken to be cognates of intelligence, are taken to ground and or justify moral status, humanity, and the right to rule. Thus, we can see that the ascription of reason, rationality, or intelligence has a lot at stake. Ascribing a high degree of rationality in Plato's Utopia legitimizes rulership. For Kant, it conveys moral status, and therefore the capacity to do moral good and be subject to moral harm. And for Descartes, reason is associated with being human in the first place. We can perhaps see how these ideas could be put to ignominious use. Under such ideologies, ascribing reason and intelligence can be wielded as a means to stratify people into rulers and the ruled, moral agents and those without agency, humans and non. Indeed, 18th century European colonial thought is littered with examples of using notions of reason and its cognates to justify social hierarchies, conquest, and subjugation. Reason, it was argued, is what separated Europeans from those that European imperial powers sought to conquer. It was argued that it was in virtue of the supposed superior rational capacity that the white conqueror had a right and even a duty to dominate and rule over the non-white peoples of their conquest. Alongside this theoretical justification for domination and subjugation, various empirical enterprises were undertaken to try to substantiate the supposed intellectual superiority of the white elite male. Some of us may be familiar with the pseudoscientific historical disciplines of phrenology and craniology. Enterprises concerned with measuring head size and examining the topography of skulls on the supposition that this would reveal something about the mental capacities of the subject. The objective of much of this discourse and the pseudosciences they produced was to create post hoc justification for extant hierarchies. White, noble, elite men were at the top, while women, non-white, and poor were at the bottom. Thus, intelligence or reason was cast as a grounds to defend this hierarchy. If white elite men were at the top, it must be in virtue of their superior capacities for reason. This inclination of looking toward reason or intelligence to justify extant social, racial, and gender hierarchies is further instantiated in the eugenics movement of the early 19th century. Sir Francis Galton, often regarded as the father of the eugenics movement, was highly preoccupied with intelligence as a grounds for optimizing populations, and he's often identified as the first to devise a means of testing for intelligence. In fact, it is with the rise of the eugenics movement, especially in the US, that the term intelligence gained prominence in the public and academic spheres. American psychologists who were proponents of the eugenics program were very interested in developing and deploying tests of intelligence in pursuit of eugenicist aims. In other words, the very idea of an intelligence test has its roots in a program and ideology with its own problematic history of admitting post hoc justifications for enforcing and reproducing social, cultural, and political hegemonic hierarchies. Cave draws a connection between notions of reason and intelligence, sociopolitical hierarchies and colonialism, and the dichotomy between civilization and nature that was also a dominant theme of 17th and 18th century colonial thought. Civilization, it was supposed, was the product of a rational, intelligent society. On the other hand, the natural, untamed, or savage was necessarily irrational, unintelligent, and barbarous. The civilizing of nature was thus cast as, in part, the exertion of reason over the wild and untamed natural world. We can see how this idea dovetails with justifications for colonialism and conquest. To colonize was to, in part, civilize peoples regarded as lacking reason by virtue of their natural and savage nature. This ideology also sheds light on the way technology was and is still often construed. Technology is opposed to nature insofar as technology is a product of the reason and rationality that is supposed to overcome and dominate it. The fruits of intelligence were the civilizing force over untamed nature. It was by means of technological products of reason and rationality that nature is overcome and civilized. Thus, we can begin to see how the notion of intelligence can be seen to be intertwined with broad notions of technology long before artificial intelligence technologies were ever a consideration. When we turn our focus now to contemporary use of the term intelligence, as well as projects to define and test it, it is worthwhile to be mindful of this history. Cave cautions that we ought to be wary of fetishizing intelligence, holding this poorly defined and historically fraught concept as the paragon of human virtues. The troubled past and unclarity of the concept of intelligence makes it a tenuous foundation on which to build meritocracies. Further still, uncritical confidence that intelligence, artificial or otherwise, will deliver us from disease, poverty, or climate catastrophes harkens back to this civilization versus nature dichotomy to interesting effect. As Cave points out, there is little reason to suppose the fruits of intelligence, technology so construed, will deliver us from a climate crisis, and much more reason to suppose that technology has been and will continue to be responsible for it. As well, we have more historical reason to suppose that technology, broadly construed, is more likely to function as an entrenching force on problems of economic inequality rather than a solution to such problems. Indeed, Cave points out that when it comes to current applications of artificial intelligence technologies, they stand to eliminate mostly quote-unquote blue-collar jobs, and the trend of negative economic impacts of intelligence technologies is by and large falling disproportionately on economically disadvantaged people. A final note on the subtitle of this video. In another article entitled On the Dark History of Intelligence as Domination, Cave also presents elements of this argument, making the case that intelligence has, as the title suggests, an inextricable link to domination and subjugation, which we have seen laid out here in this video. He remarks that this history gives insight to popular science literature's preoccupation with and fears of intelligent supercomputers or super AI. An AI that is more intelligent than all of us is empowered to dominate us all. No wonder we're afraid of Skynet. History tells us that whosoever lays claim to the highest intelligence lays claim to domination.